And record this. Let's start again. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Diane Bostonjack. I am the membership manager for the American Institute of Biological Sciences. If you're not familiar with AIBS, we are a national scientific organization dedicated to advancing biology for the benefit of science and society. We work to ensure that the public, legislators, funders, and the community of biologists have access to and use information that will guide them in making informed decisions about matters that require biological knowledge. And one way we do this is by providing decision makers information, and we do so independently and in partnership with our organizational members and our business partners. So before we start, I'm just going to go over a little housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded for archival purposes. If you have any issues, please use the chat feature on the bottom of your screen. And I or somebody else from AIBS will assist you. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So there is also on the bottom of your screen a little Q&A section. You go ahead and click on that and you can type in your question. So that is the end of my little housekeeping. So thank you for joining today's webinar. So today we have Mr. Patrick Reilly joining us. He is from the Foreign Affairs, he's a Foreign Affairs Officer with the U.S. Department of State, serving in the Office of Conservation and Water in Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Scientific Affairs. In this role, he serves as the U.S. focal point for Nagoya and the department's expert on access and benefit sharing issues. He works on genetic resource issues across various multilateral instruments, including the Convention of Biodiversity, the Nagoya Protocol, the International Treaty on Plant and Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, the Influenza Pandemic Framework, that one's a tongue twister for me, and the Biodiversity Beyond National Borders negotiations. Thank you so much today for joining. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Diane, and thank you to AIBS for inviting me here. I know this Nagoya Protocol is a hot topic within your community, and it's also within our department. So I'm happy to be able to get this information out, talk with your members and all of you guys, and figure out kind of what your questions are and how the U.S. government can help. I'll give, as Diane mentioned, I'll give kind of a short presentation, about 20-25 minutes or so, and then mostly questions. Really looking much forward to having a good back and forth, and hopefully we can figure out how we can help you guys. So as a leader in genetic resources development, you can read our mission statement, but really what we're trying to do is that the U.S. is a global leader in this field, as AIBS shows and as all of you show, and what we're trying to do is that access to genetic resources is critical for all of you and for U.S. scientists, for U.S. Private businesses, for U.S. researchers, and that's what we're always trying to work on at the U.S. State Department. So very quickly, in the Nagoya Treaty, Nagoya Protocol, there are a few definitions, and I want to walk through those for a second, just so you know officially what we're talking about, because it may be different than colloquially what you use in every day. So genetic material, you can see the definition up on the screen, but really it's essentially stuff that is made with DNA, and then genetic resources is stuff that could be worth something or is worth something. For us, functional units of heredity is the typical definition of a gene that is throughout the treaty, and so hopefully that will help. And then genetic resources and genetic material are kind of used interchangeably in most of the material about the Nagoya Treaty. So why does the State Department care about genetic resources? Why are they important globally? You're all here, so you kind of know that, but generally we view it as helpful to academia for basic research and the understanding of life, and agriculture, working on food security, medicine and health, research and development, and then just the kind of social importance of genetic resources, indigenous and local knowledge, for example, the neem tree you saw on the first slide, and an appreciation of nature. So why do we care at the government as we walk through this? There we go. Mostly it's because the economic implications of this. The U.S., we're a leader with many of our genetic sequencing corporations, with many of our scientists, with many of our labs and research universities in genetic material. We'd like to try and stay that way. the global health impacts, as we're kind of seeing now from both from the coronavirus, food security issues, as genetic material and genetic sequencing gets better. We're working on trying to increase crop yields and other agricultural issues for environmental conservation reasons, and then respecting indigenous communities. But that's not kind of everyone's focus on this. All right. Some people view the gathering of genetic resources from other countries as a prospecting biopiracy issue. And then still others kind of view it as a green gold. It's the next level of oil discovery or of gas deposits is going to be who has the most genetic resources. So what is our role as the State Department? Well, we're engaged in several international instruments, as Diane mentioned, that address conservation and sustainable use of genetic resources. My particular focus is on the access to genetic resources and the sharing of the benefits that arrive from their use. We'll get more detail later, but there are some of the treaties in the bottom of your screen on what we're doing. So now to kind of jump into the Nagoya Protocol, why you guys are all here. I think it is important to walk through a little bit of how we got to where we are, because that process is still having effects today with negotiations and relationships between countries and companies and requests for permits and what you're seeing. So in 1962, the UN General Assembly decided that countries would have sovereignty over their natural resources. This was a paradigm shift from common heritage, i.e. the British Empire model, where if you found it, it was yours, to country control. This switch was pushed heavily by the developing world, and it was around the same time as the Decolonization Committee at the UN General Assembly was also working, and it was to prevent the bioprospecting we saw earlier. That existed for about 30 years, and that idea of sovereign control over natural resources. And then in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, the Convention on Biological Diversity was opened for signature. Essentially, that's the overriding treaty for the Nagoya Protocol. And the Convention on Biological Diversity says that diversity in nature and conservation are all good. It also should be said that access to nature should be open to everyone, though under certain conditions. And the benefits of that nature and biodiversity should be shared with everyone, so it's not simply taken by one person. These are very general feel-good statements. We didn't sign up. We don't usually sign up to these statements. The US government prefers more actionable statements, but it was a larger environmental package that we were all working through and trying to move forward. And so that was signed in 92, came into effect. The Senate never ratified it, so the US is not a party to the treaty. And it existed for 10, 15 years. Then in 2007, the Indonesian government discovered that some samples of a particularly deadly strain of avian flu had made their ways to laboratories outside of Indonesia without the government's consent. So for 15 years, you had this document that was supposed to govern genetic resources, but it hadn't really been entered into force and really had rules and regulations that came about because of it. So Indonesia, in this case, stopped sharing samples. The Indonesian Ministry of Health argued that sample sharing exposed these inequalities, that developing countries with limited resources provided information and samples to WHO-affiliated laboratories, i.e. national labs in Japan, the United States, Europe, and then pharmaceutical companies in those countries would obtain access to such samples without permission from the provider government, Indonesia in that case, and develop treatment and vaccines which their own citizens could not afford. So this event and a range of other issues with the CBD led to the negotiation of the Nagoya Protocol in 2010 in an attempt to address these situations. The negotiation was a particularly fraught negotiation. At the end of 2 weeks, there was still no real consensus in sight. So the Japanese government called all the key parties in for an all-night negotiating session. The next day, a chair's text was announced as a take it or leave it text. There are some key issues that were not fully resolved, and there were some potentially contradictory conclusions amongst different signatories, but in the end it was adopted. So this now for the first time kind of moved into effect the rules from the CBD governing access and benefit sharing to genetic resources. The protocol was due to come into effect when 50 countries ratified it, and that happened in 2014 when Belarus, Burundi, Gambia, Madagascar, Mozambique, Niger, Peru, Sudan, Switzerland, Vanuatu, Uganda, and Uruguay ratified the treaty, bringing the total to 51. So this is a relatively new process that has only been in place for just over 15 years. There are now 123 countries that are party to the protocol. And the protocol, as I mentioned, expands upon the text of the CBD by saying that each country has certain obligation in relation to benefit sharing and access to genetic resources, but it is up to each country to figure out how they meet those obligations. So there really is no such thing as the Nagoya Protocol. It's really the Nagoya Protocol in country XXX, that own individual countries' rules and regulations. To dig into a little bit of the details of the Nagoya Protocol, I want to go through the kind of access and benefit sharing issues it raises. So the first thing the protocol says is that you must get permission from the provider country to be able to take out genetic resources unless otherwise determined by the provider country. So really this just means whatever their own regulations are for achieving access. Then there's benefit sharing, in which countries, negotiators, researchers, and others should negotiate an agreement to share benefits resulting from the use of genetic resources, and that's an important term, the use of genetic resources, with the provider government on mutually agreed terms. This isn't, most people think of this as monetary, but it's both non-monetary and monetary benefit sharing. And finally, what was new about the Nagoya Protocol was the idea that states who are a party to the Nagoya Protocol needed to ensure compliance with the Nagoya Protocol. So it didn't create the Nagoya Protocol didn't create any new abilities or new rights to restrict access to genetic material, other than those that were already in the CBD. What this new compliance was force kind of countries to make sure that they were following that. And so if academics, researchers, or companies from even non-party countries wanted to commercialize anything that came from genetic resources, they now had to certify compliance with sample collection if those genetic resources came from countries that were party to the treaty. And so this includes a big caveat is because, yes, this includes selling any products into the European Union. And so as one of the largest commercial markets in the world, companies and researchers now had to prove that they had a certificate of compliance in order to sell into the European Union. The Nagoya Protocol did not prevent countries that are not a party to the treaty, for example, Brazil, from instituting their own national ABS systems that they have put in place. So what is that's kind of what the access and benefit sharing issues are, but what do we view about it as the US government? Well, what we work around the world with host governments and through our embassies and through meetings and consistent discussions is that ABS measures should be clear, transparent, and non-arbitrary. They should take place consistent with commercial practice, so we don't want to see exploitative technology transfers or payments. And we support mutual agreement between providers and recipients. So we don't always inherently need to have others jump in, but we want the host government and the researcher to work together. And our information does not equal materials for us. So if you're moving digital sequence information or genetic sequence data around, is not the same as requiring an MTA or an access or a compliance certificate. And finally, for us, the big one we keep arguing is that access is just as important as benefit sharing. And so many of the international meetings you'll hear, or many of the complaints you'll hear about Nagoya are about the benefit sharing side. We keep harping on the fact that those are equal in access. You cannot get benefits if you do not allow people access as well. So given that fraught history of how Nagoya came about, there have been some challenges with implementation. This is where the US government can often help. Given the general nature of the Nagoya Protocol, each country has its own procedures for determining access benefits and compliance, or not, as may be the case in some countries. So despite 123 countries having obligation to have rules and regulations to determine access, benefit, and compliance. You don't have 123 different Nagoya regimes. Some countries have signed up but haven't created regulations yet. Others are still in the process of doing that. Others have done it and are now applying that process. Sometimes US officials or US company scientists can't get anyone in the host government to respond to an email or a phone to answer questions about requests for access. Sometimes they can't get a compliance certificate, but we can help there. And in some countries, it's not always clear who runs the process. Given that this fell under the Convention on Biological Diversity, a lot of countries, the ABS process is run by the Environmental Ministry. Others, it's the Agricultural Agency. Some it's the Scientific Agency. Some it's even the Foreign Ministries because it's a treaty. Our embassies can help your companies and universities during the access negotiations and the benefit sharing negotiations, and during implementation, navigate that bureaucracy if you're having troubles. There's also, however, a challenge with expectations versus reality, and that fraught history leading up to Nagoya brings this to the fore. The developing world expected millions of dollars would flow to them through this process, and it has not. There just hasn't been that much commercialization based on found genetic resources since 2014 for a variety of reasons. Again, utilization of this depends on access. If countries don't have a focal point or regulations or permitting procedures or a certificate process, researchers can't get access and therefore there's no benefits. A lot of the activities that's been going on since 2014 is just, since 2014, has just been research. So non-monetary benefits are the result, not cash payments. A lot of genetic resources are already held in ex situ collections from before Nagoya went into force, so the providing country doesn't have sovereignty over it. And finally, the research pipeline. In the US, the average drug takes 12 years to bring from laboratory to market. Nagoya only went into force a little over 5 years ago, so we're not quite to the benefit sharing stage yet. So this has created a lack of trust between the developing and developed world. The developing world thinks the developed world is hiding and preventing benefits from Nagoya from flowing to them, and the developed world thinks the developing world is stopping important human inventions for a cash handout. Essentially kind of email BlackBerry. Now I should restate again that these are just generalized views. I don't want to say this about every country or every industry, and developing and developed are all kind of interchangeable in this context. But I want to let you know some of the views that are out in the space and trying to deal with this issue. So where do genetic resources issues come up, and where do these access and benefit sharing issues that you're dealing with on Nagoya come up? Well, Article 4 of the Nagoya Protocol says that where a specialized ABS instrument applies, the protocol does not apply for the specific genetic resources and in cases. What this means in plain English is if it's governed by another treaty, Nagoya doesn't apply. So in WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge and Folklore, was established in 2000 to kind of deal with these issues of genetic resources and benefit sharing. Its mandate was just renewed again last year in the WIPO General Assembly, and will be hosting 7 more meetings through 2021. At that point, there will have been 46 meetings of the IGC, and they still have not completed the process. In the UN General Assembly, they're currently negotiating the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty. There are ongoing negotiations with regards to marine genetic resources. Those are due to start up again and conclude this October. The Food Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture is currently developing proposals on innovation opportunities across DSI and the challenges related to capacity to access and the use of DSI. The WHO, as many of you know, foremost in the news because of recent events, is dealing with ABS and DSI issues in the PIP framework, the seasonal flu framework, the WHO Executive Board, and sample sharing. And finally, as Diane mentioned, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, or shortly known as ITPGRFA, just concluded a 6-year negotiation process in an attempt to update their standard material transfer agreement. It had no agreement was reached at the end of that 6 years for, among other reasons, differences on DSI between developing and developed countries. So Nagoya Protocol, and so it's not just the Nagoya Protocol in which genetic resources and ABS issues are popping up. You can see it's kind of all across the international spectrum, no matter what issue you're working on in this space. I want to talk a little bit now, as I get to the end of this, about where this debate is moving and going. So over the next 5 to 10 years, I think the world is going to be looking to develop a system or a framework or treaties to deal with how the information associated with genetic material is handled. You know, when the important valuable things are stuff, it's the Nagoya Treaty. But when those important valuable things are zeros and ones and not physical specimens, we don't quite have the way around a coherent internationalized framework yet. The result, whatever results from this process, won't be any one answer. There'll be a combination of science and economics, international law and diplomacy. There are currently several proposals floating around. There are different opinions on how access should be granted or limited to DSI, when benefits from DSI are realized, at collection or at utilization, who the benefits flow to from use of DSI, to the provider countries or to a multilateral scheme. There are even differences on if DSI needs to be regulated at all. But in general, the US opposes any move to restrict or control access to or use DSI. Any action that hinders the sharing and use of genetic sequence data, which we use with DSI, would inhibit research and stifle innovation and would greatly hinder progress on conservation and sustainable use of genetic resources. It could potentially jeopardize broader research, food security, and public health interests. For example, researchers around the world are using genetic sequence data to describe genetic resources for food and agriculture as a tool to advance scientific study and technological innovation with enormous benefits for people and nature. Open access, public domain, and open source data, in addition to scientific collaboration, are key benefits of existing data sharing mechanisms. The important thing to know is that we're involved in all of these processes, though as a non-member in some, our leverage is limited. In all these discussions, and we're working on this issue. Finally, I want to conclude with kind of when to reach out to the US government and how we can help you. If you're trying to do research or collection in some country and your permits are being denied, please reach out to us and we can try and help and work through some of the issues. If in your discussions of material transfer agreements or even collection issues, you're having some of the protectionist views of biodiversity or DSI or intangible components, let us know. Or finally, if you're getting a lack of response from your Nagoya national focal points in each of the countries as you're going in to try and get your certificate and your permits, please let us know. I'll make a little pitch here for at the end of our session. There's the Nagoya Protocol Learning portal if you would like to learn more. It's learnnagoya.com, and you can share it with any of your researchers or your students or others. It's not affiliated with the USG, but its goal is to kind of help individuals become familiar with Nagoya requirements so you can proactively plan your research and collaboration. It was an outcome of an NSF-funded workshop on the protocol. It's a living document, so I think they're trying to keep it updated regularly. So, and they're also looking for examples. And finally, your chance to contribute on this topic. We are hosting a public consultation and information session on March 12th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. on the use of digital sequence information of genetic resources at the U.S. Department of State and here in Washington, D.C. This is an important meeting to attend or submit electronic comments to. International discussions around the use of DSI are currently being conducted in multiple forums, as I mentioned, and they could have dramatic effects on both public and private scientific research and commercialization. As I mentioned, some parties are encouraging tracking and tracing cases for the use of DSI. During the public meeting, we'll provide a bit of an overview of where we are on DSI in regards to the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. And then we're going to listen to your comments, concerns, and questions. The goal of that meeting is a free-flowing informal discussion because it's going to help us prepare for these international negotiations coming up. If you cannot attend in person, you can also submit comments electronically, which will also be sent to the U.S. government negotiating team, and electronic submissions are due by April 30th. Submissions can be made via the internet at regulations.gov and entering that docket number you see on your screen. So my name is Patrick Reilly. There's my contact info on there. If you have any questions or want to register for the public meeting, you can shoot me. And my colleague, Katie Scholl, who puts most of the great ideas into this presentation, and all the mistakes are mine. All the great ideas are hers. She also works in this issue at the State Department with me, and her contact info is there as well. And so thank you. That's it from me. I've talked far too long, so hopefully thank you for indulging me.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you so much. I went ahead and minimized your screen. So now we have the Q&A section session. Do you see the Q&A box? Oh, all right, perfect. So we already have some typed in there. So if you want to just go ahead and roll with it.
All right. So Wayne McKenna has asked, is there a way for scientists whose research is relevant to the Nagoya Protocol to contact me or otherwise engage in policy development around this important topic? So one, yes, there is. You have my email. I am also the US Nagoya focal point. So if you email usnagoyafp@state.gov, I think, it also comes to me. So that's where you can reach out where questions or issues with research permits or getting contacts in foreign governments, and we can help you. The other is please come to that meeting on March 12th or submit electronic comments. The more people, the more wider range of views we have there, the better as we prepare for these upcoming meetings on the CBD and Nagoya globally. All right. In my experience, most of the colleagues with whom I have discussed this, Nagoya Protocol has negatively impacted research. So I would say, does the US government share this view? And if so, what is specifically done to address this? So I do think the US government does see many of the same concerns raised by researchers about limiting access in some places and problems with Nagoya. That said, I don't know that the problems are always inherently with Nagoya. What we're trying to work with is through the implementation. The treaty's goals are the same thing as CBD, that they want to make sure that there's access to genetic resources and that there is sort of fair and equitable sharing of those benefits from those genetic resources. But as they say, the devil's in the details. And so making sure that health ministries are aware what environmental ministries are doing and provide some exemptions in case of pandemics, to make sure that scientific ministries are aware of what environmental ministries are doing on potential scientific research in their country. So we're trying to raise those concerns, make those connections, and just make people aware and try and work through and fix some of the issues that are being raised. Because I think it's a very laudable goal of both Nagoya and CBB that we're also trying to work for. All right, I guess, done. Arnie Moores would like to know, can a Canadian attend the March 12th meeting? You can, you just have to bring your passport and you have to register in advance. But again, we're not trying to limit the amount of views that we hear on this. We're looking to hear from both NGOs and companies and scientists and researchers, public universities, private universities, federally funded lab, whoever we can. The more views we get, again, on this issue will help us go in.
I'm going to add, I know some people chatted, I will include the email and the link to register and all of that in the follow-up email tomorrow. So don't worry about frantically trying to write it all down. It'll be included in the follow-up email tomorrow to everybody.
So someone asked, can you address how the protocols deal with genetic materials acquired prior to CBD and maintained as living materials in germ plasma repository or resulting in commercialization, albeit on a smaller scale? I will say I am not a scientist. I'm the diplomat on the side of this, so I'm not entirely sure all the answers on this, but I will say that the CBD and Nagoya don't impact collections that existed prior to the CBD and Nagoya coming into effect. Now, whether that changes because they're living in germplasm repositories or others, you'll have to ask our lawyers on that, or your head scientist. Or if you send me an email, I can get you in touch with our lawyers and scientists who can answer that question to your specific concern or need. Do some countries consider DSI as falling under Nagoya? Not now. And our US government policy and statement is that information is not material. And the Nagoya Protocol only deals with genetic material. And that's why I specifically read out those negotiated definitions at the very beginning. But that was negotiated in 1992. And so the world has changed dramatically since then, and science has changed dramatically since then. So I know there are lots of questions coming up about that now, and that's why we're having all of these discussions about DSI. Individual countries' ABS systems may consider DSI for access and benefit sharing in the same way, but they're not falling under Nagoya. We answered that one. Sorry, I'm trying to click through. Yep, well, we will. Yes, again, March 12th meeting, please come. What do I need to do if I would like to collect plant material in the US for research and I'm based at a US university? So if you're collecting plant material inside the US does not have any federal ABS laws or national ABS laws. The National Park Service has their own ABS requirements, and that is because of thermal bacilla. It's gonna, again, I'm not the scientist. Essentially, the polymer used to help DNA was found in Yellowstone National Park. The United States government, the Park Service, despite this material being, worth millions and millions and millions of dollars, never received any benefits from it. And it's still in use today for replicating DNA and separating DNA and sequencing DNA. But that's actually the policy we've tried to push, is that, these are for the good of science of humankind. But you do need to check with your local, your state may have some park rules, your state may have some national forest state forest rules. So you have to check with your locality on that. I will say where US researchers often fall afoul of the Nagoya Protocol is when they go someplace else and then bring it back, thinking because they're publishing or accessing issues inside the United States, they don't fall under Nagoya because we don't have our own ABS system. But the collection of ABS in a country that is party to Nagoya means you have to follow those rules as well. Virginia Zalbrecker wrote, one of the challenges academic and nonprofit researchers have in complying with Nagoya is limitations from federal agencies and allowing researchers to use funding to support foreign scientists. This means we often lack the resources needed to support local collaborators. Has state reached out to annual federal funding agencies about this issue? Yes, we have. Not that specific issue, and I'm actually happy to bring it back and as we talk about through the Genetic Resources Interagency Working Group. We are, however, our interagency is very broad on this. We have a group from HHS, NSF, NOAA, Commerce Department, US Department of Agriculture, the Smithsonian Institute, and others who are within the State Department as well, where we all talk about this issue. So while I am the focal point, I am in no way, shape, or form the US government voice on this issue. It is shaped by many. And so your concern about support for foreign scientists, I can raise at the next meeting as well. What if the fieldwork is conducted in countries that are not subscribed to Nagoya? That's from Pamela Popo. Then it's just up to the local ABS laws and whatever that country is. You will, however, if you're selling into a country that is a party to Nagoya with the commercialization of any of your product or research, have to prove that none of it came from other countries that were a party to Nagoya. So this is where the kind of certificate of compliance question gets in. And as a US focal point, I often get questions about ABS to the United States. And I think it just often an email back that says we have no national ABS legislation is often good enough for them to prove that they, asked the United States and we were what our position was. What is your success rate at intervening on behalf of scientists? I couldn't give you a success rate. Lots of people in our office work on this issue. Lots of our embassies work on this issue. But I would say that we're often successful in at least getting discussion of this issue going. And you know, it's not something where you kind of shoot us an email and we let it die. We'll raise it with the host government. We'll talk with them. We can't always get your permit granted. I don't think that's our job, but our job is just to make sure that the access and benefit sharing mechanisms are clear and be able to followed on a consistent basis. And if that's not happening, then we can help. Is not a signature. The Kristen Genmel wrote, New Zealand, Aratora, and Morena are not a signatory to the Nagoya Protocol. Any suggestion on what scientists in New Zealand can do to encourage the New Zealand government to sign? So I don't know the answer to that one. You'll have to approach the New Zealand government, but 123 countries around the globe are signatories. Sarah Loading wrote, does Nagoya recognize a global definition of sovereign territories as it applies to marine boundaries? Sovereign territory is usually 12 nautical miles from the mean low tide, or is the boundary recognized as the EEZ? This is all laid out in the US law of the sea, and under the law of the sea, they're currently negotiating the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction rules to set up and decide on some of these issues. So I would say watch this space. If I'm not giving you the perfect answer to your specific question, again, please shoot me an email and I'll happy to get it to our marine experts on this. Just to make sure I understand the role of DOS state, sorry. Do you primarily help with diplomacy, facilitate negotiation, help US research to make sure that they comply or coordinate with companies where the US has a presence or others? So yes, that is the DOS role. State Department helps negotiate these international agreements and help shape them so that our researchers, our citizens, our companies are treated fairly, accomplish the goals. So we're at the table for these negotiations. But once they're in place, our embassies are also there to help serve US citizens, US corporations, US universities in those countries. And so as the Nagoya Protocol lays out steps to access and benefit sharing, we can help those countries and help those individuals, citizens, corporations, researchers, ensure that the companies, the country is complying with their own ABS regulations and it's clear and it's transparent. Sean Lahammer wrote, do you have an MTA template that you can share that you recommend as a working alternative to the Nagoya Protocol? I actually chose this question to answer because I would say they're being negotiated in many different places. So a lot will depend on your field, a lot will depend on what you're collecting, a lot will depend on how you're utilizing it. And it's also a joint process. In some places it may be easier for monetary benefits, in some places it may be non-monetary benefits. So we kind of recommend that the researcher and the providing country work it out together for whatever they want their MTA to be. Some countries have an MTA that almost everyone kind of standardly has to sign up for. Others, I think, negotiate on a case-by-case or a sector-by-sector basis. Anonymous attendee, in your opinion, what would be the best way forward for DSI to maintain open access for research while enabling monetary benefit sharing? I chose to answer this question is because I would like to hear from you guys in our March 12th meeting about what that answer should be. As we start to head into these negotiations over the next 12 months, 24 months, we'd really love to get researchers and companies and scientists who are working with this every day to share their ideas with us to ensure that we can balance all of the competing needs in the ways that serve the United States best. The biggest problem that we find in collaboration and working with scientists worldwide is the lack of awareness on the protocol. What is the plan to address this within the United States? That's a very good question and something we're also struggling with ourselves. So the first is Q&A sessions like this, webinars. We're very thankful to AIBS for putting out its own word on this. You know, sometimes we walk into places and they have no knowledge of the Nagoya Protocol. AIBS and Dr. Grope were extremely proactive in reaching out to us and saying, we know this, but we need to make sure all our members know this. So that's very helpful. We're also going to be doing as many of these as we can to try and get the word out about what the protocol is, what the US government role is, and working with professional societies, and science academies, and others to try and get the word out as well. If you have other suggestions, please let us know. We're happy to take them in and consider and see what we can do. Anonymous has asked, is the Nagoya Protocol and the ITP-GRFA fully harmonized? If not, which takes precedence in ABS for plant genetic resources? I'm gonna have to say, I thought I knew the answer to that question, but as I walk through it, I'm not sure I do. So I'm gonna have to say, I think you're gonna have to ask our lawyers, and if you have your specific question, you can email it to me and I can get you in touch with the right person. Iro Tashani wrote, I work in Nigeria and bring tissue specimens back to the US. Nigeria is a signatory, but they don't have a focal point. No, they're supposed to, because all countries are supposed to have a focal point. How do I comply with on the Nagoya Protocol on the Nigerian side and the US side? And also, how do I get a Nagoya permit along with my other permits from the US? So this is actually a very good question. And one of the reasons I selected it is because this is often kind of the type of question I get at the State Department. What I will say is that the US side, there's no Nagoya permit you need. There's nothing on our side of what you need to do with regards to Nagoya. You will, however, have to apply all export and importing rules and any local ABS rules as well. So Nagoya, you're safe with the United States. Everything else, I couldn't tell you. On the Nigerian side, if you're having some issues, they should have a national focal point. And all of those national focal points should be on the www.cbd.int page, the Convention on Biological Diversity. Each country who's a signatory should have one on there. But again, this is where we can help in is if you can't reach out to someone, if you don't know anyone, or if you shoot an email there and it just never gets answered, let us know and we can work with our embassy in Nigeria to try and work through these issues and see if they're who the correct point person is. A colleague from Germany collected biological material in Ecuador. He now wants to deposit this material into a collection in Canada. What does this involve regarding the Nagoya Protocol? Wow. I would say it's very complicated, and I'm not entirely sure where Nagoya comes in for all of those countries because I don't know what their ABS regulations are, who's in which country has signed on to it for that. But each of the national focal points in Germany, Ecuador, and Canada can help you with that. But I think in using this as a just illustrative example, not your specific case, Frank, I would say that, you've collected in Ecuador. The Germans will require, just to kind of left possible, the Germans, as a member of the EU, could require a certificate of Nagoya compliance from Ecuador. And then when you get to Canada, the Canadians could ask that you have the compliance as well. But again, each of those individual countries are going to need, you're going to have to reach out to the focal points there. Matthew Pace has asked, can you address the tracking responsibilities for institutions and or researchers? How and for how long are we responsible for tracking genetic material once it is obtained from a specimen? That goes to each of the individual ABS regulations in each of the individual countries. The earlier answer, as I mentioned, kind of with there's no such thing as the Nagoya Protocol. There's the Nagoya Protocol in XXX country. And so if you go to some place at Nigeria, as an earlier questioner did, their ABS regulations may say you have to track and trace it forever. Other places may say 5 years. Other places may say till you get your certificate. But again, it's up to the ABS regulations in place and wherever you collect your sample. The National Park, and Hitchcock wrote, the National Park Service has the authority to do benefit sharing. Yes, they do. And it's the National Parks Omnibus Management Act. We already answered that one. Ron Reed has asked, everyone is obviously keen on sharing benefits from using genetic resources, but is there any talk with regards to responsibility for the negative impact related to genetic resources such as viral outbreaks, invasive species, and those that are related to fiscal damage that comes with this? So I will say that the reason I picked this question from Ron was that those are all unique cases that aren't particularly dealt with in Nagoya per se. So were you to classify something as an invasive species, different rules may apply. Were you to classify something as the other rules will apply. Viral outbreaks, we're seeing now that countries are trying to negotiate individual MTAs. And as I mentioned, that comes up under the Nagoya Protocol. If you have a protocol that is different, then you can negotiate that as well. So they don't always, those negative impacts you're discussing don't always fall under Nagoya, but those are always issues that we at the State Department are concerned about and trying to work through globally. Anonymous has asked, are samples already existing in public culture collections also forced to follow the Nagoya Protocol? Ex situ collections do not follow under the Nagoya Protocol. So if they are already there, then they don't. But again, on your specific case, you'd have to ask your specific ABS country to see how they handle it. Paul Merrick has asked, what various forms do the certificate of compliance take? It will be very different in different countries. Some will be an email from the Environment Ministry that says you're fine to go collect samples. Other may be a formal permit you may receive. Others may be a certificate. Again, it's up to the individual ABS regulation in each country as to what your certificate will look like. And our last question, there are a number of workshops and events happening related to DSI, but they're not very well advertised and are very easily missed. Do you have any advice for the best way to find out about these? I don't, because we're also trying to catch them all globally ourselves as we go through them. But I can note that the Convention on Biological Diversity is the kind of overarching, and their meetings page always posts all of their meetings from both the subcommittee meetings to the individual thematic sessions on DSI. The World Conservation Congress does a number of works on this as well, and they'll have some on their webpage. The ABS initiative, capacity building initiative, which is in partnership with the European Union, the government of Norway, the government of Germany, and a few others, also has some meetings listed on there through your scientific societies. But any event you guys know of that you think the US government should know about, attend, maybe participate, please send our way, because again, as you mentioned, we're trying to get the word out about this, hear as many views as possible, influence these discussions to make sure that it's the best deal for our US companies, universities, researchers, and citizens. So I think that's it from me on the questions. Diane, is there anything else? Am I missing?
Nope, I think that's all the questions that came through. Nice amount. If you have anything else you want to add, again, I will, if it's okay with you, I want to make sure I add that information on how to join the meeting.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'll include it with tomorrow's email that goes out as a reminder and where to find the recording and all that fun stuff.
So, all I can say is that if you have any questions or anything we can do to help, you think we may be able to help with, please send us an email. I can't always promise you we can help, and I can't always promise you we'll have the answers, but we can at least get back to you and let you know what we're thinking or where we are. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and hopefully we receive as many of you as possible on March 12th. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you, Patrick, so much for today's webinar, and thank you everyone for joining. Please visit our website, aibs.org, to watch recordings of this webinar and past webinars. And if you're interested in sponsoring a future program like this, please contact us at membership@aibs.org. We would like to thank the community and all our organizational members for their support. Without them, we would not be able to provide these webinars. If your organization is not a member yet, please join us today and get the benefits of AIBS membership. So thank you again, everyone. Keep a lookout for that email. It should be coming tomorrow, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.